proud to be offering you this brief talk on melancholia for two reasons. The first is because I will discuss Freud's very wonderful essay, Mourning and Melancholia. And the second is because I will finally have the chance to discuss Lars von Trier's very excellent film, Melancholia. I was asked to speak about nihilism today, and I think you'll see the connection very quickly. I want to thank everyone for coming, Haley and the Alternative Spirituality Club for inviting me especially, and this is a really impressive turnout for such a depressing talk, one that is essentially about nothingness. We may have set a record. To summarize Freud's essay very quickly, in case you have not read it, turns out maybe you haven't. Mourning and melancholia are conditions that both arise from the loss of an object or ideal. Both result in painful dejection, loss of interest in the world, inhibition of activity, but solely for melancholia, a lowering of self-regard and self-esteem, sometimes to the point of a paranoid expectation for punishment. Perhaps this is not unlike our main character's proclamation in Lars von Trier's film that the earth is evil and we don't need to mourn for it. When speaking about an oncoming planet cleverly named Melancholia that will soon be colliding with the earth and subsequently ending all life. This particular difference in symptoms is important to keep in mind, and I'll be coming back to it later. But for now, it's important to understand the difference on a very basic level, that in mourning, we slowly come back to ourselves. We grieve, we are pained by memories, but our ego eventually lets go of the lost object. And this is viewed as a reasonable response and process in lieu of a painful loss. This is not the case in melancholia. Here, the object is set up within the ego and forms an essential role in defining its character. A painful ambivalence occurs, shaping every love relation or existing as a love-hate relationship to the object, denigrating it in an attempt to destroy its hold on the libido. Melancholia is thus pathological, and perhaps its sufferer does not even know to what it is that they lost. It is rationally unjustified. What might emerge are symptoms like sleeplessness, lack of nourishment, an overcoming of the will to live, and what I'm going to argue for as an epistemological privilege, true knowledge or understanding of one's nature, the horror of humanity, as I'll refer to it here. And of course, I'm interested specifically in these last 2 points as they refer to nihilism. In the Conspiracy Against the Human Race, a contrivance of horror, Thomas Ligotti makes an argument about the continued existence of the human race in the face of what Julius Bonson so wonderfully describes as a history of indiscriminate butchery and mutual slaughter. Ligotti contests that evolution overshot its boundaries in what Peter Zeff refers to as a surplus of consciousness. Now, beyond being capable of hunting and gathering and fucking, a few of the favorites, the necessities, consciousness continued. And we now can adequately assess the horrors of the world. Disease, war, torture, climate change, I could go on forever. And far from sustaining life, this unnecessary surplus of consciousness, which makes all this understanding possible, actually prepares us for suicide. And if you want to know what the nihilist position is, I think that I would fairly sum it up with something like human consciousness warrants suicide. If you've watched True Detective, any fans? Too young? Fine. You're familiar with Matthew McConaughey's famous rant that I think the honorable thing for our species to do is to deny our programming. Stop reproducing. Walk hand in hand into extinction. One last midnight, brothers and sisters, opting out of a raw deal. And for Ligotti, it is precisely this raw deal that consciousness exposes for us, and that we then ironically spend the entirety of our lives trying to drown out, dumb down, and escape. This is what TV is for. You're young. Your streaming services. It's what religion tries to defer to an ultimate creator to justify all the suffering you go through, and the very obvious evil in this world. And of course, family cultures, clubs, schools, teams. All of these work to anchor you so you can ignore or at the least overlook the very real and material fact that you exist and are thus capable of the terrifying realization that there is no purpose to any of this. And what sits behind all of this is a mutual agreement that all of us, nobody will bring this up. Of course, you can be a defeatist or an existentialist or Henry Miller or the Coen brothers, because no, Donnie, these men are nihilists. No laugh, thank you. And you can do quite well for yourself, but you're not going to succeed as a serious thinker advocating that we should walk off the edge of the earth, which I think is a fairly reasonable pursuit. I've been dreaming about the consequence of this talk for months. The human condition is terrifying because, as Ligotti theorizes, what humans really are amounts to a kind of uncanny puppet animated by some imminent vitality, a collection of drives and urges to fuck and eat and sleep, again, some of the favorites, that really amount to nothing, but yet continue to push us on when we really know there's no reason for any of it. Despite the remarkable amount of time we spend trying to justify why all of this really serves a purpose. There's a startling gif of a little girl repeating, "What is love? A neurochemical con job." And this is essentially true of all of our feelings and even our deeply held beliefs. And when something startles us and disturbs our reality enough so that we realize this, that we're not really in control, our minds are constantly going, our bodies are constantly being drawn to things, when we take a moment and we realize that we are not the driver, so to speak, in this car, it is truly like a horror movie. What are these things that appear as human beings but are really only puppets? So the only solution, as Matthew McConaughey reveals, is that we have to own up to this puppetry act, accept our deplorable situation, and end the fanatical and destructive horror that is the human race. David Benatar, in his work, Better to Never Have Been, summarizes the logics of this quite well. He says, well, if you're alive, you will suffer. You'll watch your friends die, be murdered, get cancer, you or someone you know will get raped, go through breakups, struggle to pay bills, student loans, on and on, whatever. You will have a bad time. At some point, you will suffer. A great young filmmaker is here tonight, my friend Mosa Montalongo. In her short film, Meaningless, a young man proclaims of the horrors of the world, something like, if there's a food insecurity issue, why don't we just plant some crops? You know, like, if we have issues with homelessness, let's build some homes. How silly, right? Address a problem directly. No, never. The pure number of justifications we have for why we should have our boot to another man's neck is purely fantastic, and perhaps man's most astonishing feature. He hates himself. But some will argue that there are good and enjoyable things too. However, if you never existed, you'd never know of any of those good things, and you'd also have refrained from suffering, whereas all humans who live, they will always suffer. So the ethical choice is always to avoid reproduction. Perfect logical sense, it's impenetrable. And I love this argument, but it's very stupid. Why appeal to rationalism when you've just spent so much time arguing about these innate drives, psychological, animalistic, that shape us, that push us on without our consent? We are emotional beings, not smart, not reasonable. All of our academic work can evidence that. Who are we building these great shrines of knowledge to? What purpose does any of it serve if we can't even honestly answer to the fundamental human condition at the heart of all of our lives? Purposeless, miserable violence endures us all. I'm seeing some nodding, which is, I never expected that. That's great. It'll get better. And again, all we can really offer ourselves are attempts to escape that. Why else would we vote for Donald Trump? What else could describe this besides succumbing to mere idiocracy, destruction, and a profound hatred of consciousness? Another Lars von Trier film might be valuable here as well. and impartial to it. It's called The Idiots. And it's about a group of individuals who want to break from the current social order, life, and what really amounts as well to consciousness by pretending to be handicapped. But far from some cruel parody, these individuals actually find themselves in a way through their abandonment of values, responsibility, and the existential quandary we call life. They've somehow found a way to jolt themselves out of it. If I've been depressing enough, I'd like to move on to something more depressing. That was good. Here we can start tying things together. So Ligotti calls those individuals unaffected by all the means which are presented to dull consciousness as pessimists. These sad curmudgeons just cannot accept that life is worth living, no matter what kind of evidence of temporary joy you throw at them. What is interesting is that for Ligotti, this isn't a philosophical position or a choice or something you can do, but this is a kind of a person. It's an internal thing. It is a condition. So now we can bring back Freud. Could melancholia not be the condition of Ligotti's pessimism? Obviously, I think so. So if we recall two of the main differences between melancholia and mourning, one of the most serious is self-hatred and loss of self-esteem. With this, the individual is presented a strange window into her own nature, all of a sudden aware that she is selfish and a liar, a cheat, a person who causes harm to others and who suffers, leading Freud to proclaim that those who have melancholia have a keener eye for the truth than other people who are not melancholic. And in the only bit of whimsy in the essay, he states, "We only wonder why a man has to be ill before he can be accessible to a truth of this kind." Can the melancholic see what others cannot? Do they have a lens and a view of the condition of life which offers them sharper and more accurate insights? I want to argue they do. And I want to argue that these insights and this condition are precisely what Ligotti is calling pessimism, an unremitting failure to accept that life could be good or meaningful. And I think this is only more true if we look to that second major difference between melancholia and mourning. And I think the way Freud words it only supports the point ever more fruitfully, and that is that melancholia creates the necessary condition to overcome the instinct which compels every living thing to cling to life. It creates the possibility of suicide. The pessimist is thus capable of overcoming consciousness, the drives of sex and hunger within herself, and ultimately the instinct which directs us to life, preventing the reasonable choice of suicide. The earth is evil. We don't need to grieve for it. I would like to turn to Melancholia, the film, again now. I've argued that the psychological condition of melancholia is a kind of epistemic privilege and a power when it comes to the debate of the human condition, and will further argue that the film evidences this as well. The film is about a young woman plagued by serious depression, not ironically, in the end of the world. She is deplorable and unlikable, cheating on her husband during the wedding, refusing a bonus offered by her boss as a wedding gift, and spending the majority of the night in a bathtub as her guests socialize and her generous hosts wonder where she is. Strangely, as the wedding ends and the movie proceeds and the characters are left to prepare for the end of the world, our protagonist, antagonist, I don't know, Justine is the only character prepared for such a challenge. She plays games with her nephew, consoles her sister, and continues lying on the earth, staring up at the sky, unmoved that a runaway planet is about to smash into the earth, ending her life and everyone else's. All the while, her sister cries and attempts to distract herself, looking to experiences with her family as a way of making meaning in the face of death. Similarly unprepared and emotionally disturbed, her esteemed scientist husband denies the possibility that established academics could ever be wrong, arguing the planet will not hit Earth while doing reasonable things like finding rations, only to discover that the planet obviously will collide with Earth as he runs off to hide in the stables and kill himself, leaving his wife and son to fend for themselves. But don't worry, they have Justine to cheer them up. The irony should not escape you. Rationalism cannot answer for the human condition and the horrors of life, and we should be honest enough with ourselves not to make such trivial attempts. Justine makes no such attempts. Interestingly enough, she seems to be certain the planet, Melancholia, will collide before anyone else does. So certain, the viewer is left to question if she is really having a kind of clairvoyance with visions, as is offered by a few smaller proclamations, such as when she insists she knows the precise number of marbles in a jar, or if her secret knowledge of the future is really just a coincidence, some mad woman's hysteria. But I would like to pose it differently. Perhaps the hysteria really is an epistemic privilege, and Justine is evidencing something to us that non-pessimists just can't seem to get a view of. That is, what we have deemed to be order and meaningful life, culture, government, etc., is really just a widely accepted fiction to dull the panic of consciousness. Is then Justine and our not melancholic people what Nietzsche refers to as the heavy drops of rain before the storm, those preparing us for the lightning and the Übermensch, the evolution of humanity. Do the depressive and unreasonable symptoms of the unaffected melancholic not reveal to us the strings of the institutional apparatuses of a culture that sustains life through mechanics of numbing us, distracting us, and drugging us in an attempt to dumb down a surplus of consciousness capable of recognizing life for what it really is, triggering us to end it all? Indeed, life is only on earth and not for long, as Justine puts it. I quiver to think life is something worth preserving in its current state. And revelations aside, I don't know that any comprehension or illumination of this condition could make it so either. But I do want to say that just as anarchy, the lack of government, something that I'm also a proponent of, is so often equated with chaos, and it's not. Terrorism by the state is just called war, isn't it? Nihilism, or the lack of meaningful order in our universe, also does not necessitate erratic or what we might deem irresponsible behavior. It is simply the acceptance of the obvious order of life as it sits. I'm only stating that we might begin to see things more clearly. Thanks.